na estação do coração. Vai brilhar no céu, imperatriz, as 11 estrelas do teu pavilhão. Alô, nação leopoldinense! No gogó! La la ya, 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 ya. Vem brincar nesse trem, amor que vai parar na estação do coração. Vai brilhar no céu, imperatriz, as 11 estrelas do teu pavilhão. Vem brincar nesse trem, amor que vai parar na estação do coração. Vai brilhar no céu, imperatriz, as 11 estrelas do teu pavilhão. Oi, Maria, Maria, uma princesa, também sonhava um dia um príncipe encontrar. E ouviu do rei de França em Neoluxe a bonança. Maria Antonieta dos Cerais, em Portugal, outra rainha, Dona Maria. A louca não podia governar, ele estava temendo a revolução. E entrega o reino a João, regente assim se fez, e o imperador francês ordena a invasão. Ou ficam todos, ou todos vão embarcar nessa aventura e renovar Napoleão. Ou ficam todos, ou todos vão embarcar nessa aventura. Eu levo a Napoleão. Cruzaram mares, chegaram ao Brasil, são novos ares. Progresso e a transformação, vieram as Marias, toda a fidalguia, Dom João. E o tempo passou, irão se casar duas Marias da mesma raiz, Luísa com Napoleão e Leopoldina. Será nossa imperatriz, será também nome de rei, e passeiramos a nossa estação, onde imperam Marias e Joãos. Vem brincar nesse trem, amor que vai parar na estação do coração. Faz brilhar no céu, imperatriz, as 11 estrelas do teu pavilhão. Vem brincar nesse trem, amor que vai parar na estação do coração. Faz brilhar no céu, imperatriz, as 11 estrelas do teu pavilhão. Oi, Maria, Maria, uma princesa, também sonhava um dia um príncipe encontrar. E ouviu do rei de França em Neoluxe a bonança. Maria Antonieta dos Cerais, em Portugal, outra rainha, Dona Maria. O swing da Leopoldina, a louca não podia governar. Sim, ele estava temendo a revolução. Entrega o reino a João, regente assim fez.
There you go. Have a seat. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cocktail Hour lecture. I know it's a bit late for most of you to want to hear about Brazil, but because the ship is so busy, this talk is now because, of course, we're getting to Rio de Janeiro tomorrow. And this is, for those of you who have been there, those of you who certainly heard about it, it is one of the great harbor entrances in the world. It is good to get up in the morning and watch the entrance, just like this bay we came in today. It is a spectacular mountainside harbor on a great city with the ocean all around it. And so that makes Rio de Janeiro probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world from afar. But as you will find out as you get into the city, it is a city with many problems and has a sort of a dual personality of both being rich and leisurely and also desperate and poor, all mixed up together. And the contrasts in Rio de Janeiro are probably as great as you'll see in any city around the world. And like some other parts of the developing world, there's almost no middle class that live in this major city of Brazil. It used to be the capital, and as Phil Martin said the other day, the capital moved to Brasilia back in 1960. So Rio de Janeiro's had somewhat of a difficult time because it had been the royal capital when there was an emperor of Brazil, and it was the leading city for so long that in the modern era, the last few decades, Rio de Janeiro has seen much of its business move to Sao Paulo, and of course the government moved to Brasilia, and then a lot of poor people move into Rio de Janeiro who are living up in the hillsides. Now my personal experience with Brazil was, I mentioned that when I was 19, I took a year off from college and came all the way through South America hitchhiking and spent months up in Peru and then came down the Amazon to Manaus, and then I went back up into Bolivia. Then I came to Brazil via Sao Paulo, and then I ended up living in Rio de Janeiro. And so at let's say a tender age of 20, I found myself living up on a sort of a mansion up on a hill overlooking Rio de Janeiro, and my life has been sort of downhill ever since. But I will show you my old neighborhood for your interest and tell you about it. But just for your orientation, this is, of course, down on the southeast coast of this great large nation. As Phil was just describing, this is a country almost the size of the United States, as large as all of Western Europe. It has 26 states, and it is called the Estados Unidos do Brasil. So it's a united federation, much like the United States, with different states that have a very different quality of both geography, some population, economy, and they have a federal constitutional government. But that means areas like Rio de Janeiro versus Sao Paulo versus Rio Grande down in the south near Uruguay, much less Amazonia in the north, are very distinct areas of Brazil. But Rio de Janeiro was the major port and the capital for a couple of centuries. Now it is a giant city of 6 million within the central area, maybe 10 million within the state of Rio de Janeiro. And we will be coming in that bay. You can see the beaches there of Ipanema, Copacabana. We'll come around. You see there's a large island where the international airport is now, and we will be docking at the main docks in the central business district, which are quite inside the great Bay of Guanabara. You can see this shows the density of the construction and the population. Most of it is in that central area on the west side of the Great Bay. There are industrial areas on the north side and then an area called Niterói on the east side. There's a lot of shipbuilding, and now there's a lot of oil industry that have moved into this bay. They have found a lot of oil off of Rio de Janeiro, which you'll see these big oil rigs, and a lot of new petroleum industry has moved in, surprisingly, into this otherwise let's say, a city that could live on tourism is experiencing somewhat of an oil boom right now. But you can also see the dark areas here. Those are actually the mountains and the parks. So Rio de Janeiro has the blessing of being surrounded by national parks and deep forests. So it has a lot of natural life right near the city, and that gives it part of its great character. Now we will be docking up there past, it says Centro there, and there's a pier. The Pier of Mauá, it's called, which is a main shipping area near the bridge over across the Bay of Guanabara. And then there's the main central city, that business district, and then the mountains are in the center, but most of the tourist area and the beaches, of course, are down toward the ocean. The Great Sweep of Copacabana, Ipanema down facing the ocean. And now there are tunnels through the mountains, so that's how the city is all connected. Now this, after we were where we were today at Paraty, you can imagine that's what Rio de Janeiro was like about 300 years ago. A beautiful open bay with hardly anybody on it, but a few houses, a few churches. Rio de Janeiro, by contrast, is a vast and very active city, and we are docking at a place where it's right next to a highway. Now when you get off from the dock, though, you see it says Praça Mauá. That's where we are, right next. You can actually walk out the terminal building to there and then walk into the downtown district. But this is a big office complex area with some big glass boxes and modern buildings, that some of which are looking pretty tired right now. And sprinkled in that are some of the historic churches and some of the beautiful parks that the city is known for. Then there are some trams, one that goes up into Santa Teresa, and then the highway goes around the main roads, around the sweep of the city in toward the Copacabana area. But this is really the heart of the city. It's not where the beaches are. This is where the business center is. Here, as you come into the bay, this is our docking area, and you can see the land is like where we just were. The coastal mountains are falling into the sea, and so there's a lot of hillside and variegated land right around, and all the city is sort of built in pockets of flat land between all of this. Here's the dock where we will be, and you can see one of the major highways is running along the pier area. So we're not landing in a very terribly pleasant place, but it's not far from walking into downtown, or you can go out and get transport readily. Now, our friends from H. Stern, Ben Brothers, and Aquamarine, they have taxis and buses to take people around town as a courtesy, and I recommend availing yourself of that opportunity. You can get a ride right over to one of their workshops, and they have beautiful museums of the gemology, and I recommend doing that and availing yourself of their hospitality. They're not right in this area, though. There's a couple of little shops in the terminal itself, but you can see here, this is near Central, but you see the peaks up there, and these are the favelas, the shacks that are built on the hill, and that is where the contrasting community is, other than the downtown shopping and business areas. Now, Rio de Janeiro was first visited in the 1502 and then established by a Portuguese captain, Estácio de Sá, in 1565. It was always a stopping place for water and food supplies for further exploration and settlement of South America. For instance, Ferdinand Magellan stopped here, and Amerigo de Vespucci stopped in Rio de Janeiro, and because it had such a beautiful harbor, it became very well known, and then became a prize of the Portuguese Empire, and then the beginning of the settlements happened inside where the Central District is. Here's one of the early charts of it. It was called the River of January because that's when it was first found by Estácio de Sá. And then later the Portuguese Empire, though, was impeded upon by the French, who came in and attacked Rio de Janeiro in the early 1600s, thinking of making it a French colony that they called Antarctica Française. Now that was abandoned as an effort because there were distractions and other wars, but there's always been a considerable presence of French culture on top of the Portuguese settlement of Brazil. The Dutch were also invaders in northern Brazil, but were driven out. But then Rio de Janeiro became the capital of Portuguese Brazil as administered from Lisbon, and then built as a primary colony. Of course, as you heard from where we were today at Paraty, they were looking for gold, and originally that was the whole point of any settlement at all. Other Portuguese, of course, went over to Asia for the great spice trade. It was only later that sugar plantations were established, mostly in the north, and that became the first boom commodity of Brazil. But because Rio de Janeiro was a better harbor than Paraty, and the road of gold took the mines in the Minas Gerais, came and made the first wealth of Rio de Janeiro. The city was built up, and it got a water supply from the upper lakes and streams of the mountains, and this aqueduct, which you can see to this day, it's right near downtown and now has a road on top of it. When Napoleon invaded Portugal and Spain, the Portuguese king João IV moved to Brazil, and this began the era of, let's say, the royal palaces of Rio de Janeiro, and there are a few of them still there, elegant mansions that were the seat of the royalty. Now then, in 1817, João went back to Lisbon, and he left his son, Dom Pedro I, who in 1822 declared Brazil an independent country. Now this was at the time when all of the Latin American countries were becoming independent of their colonial masters in Europe, and so Dom Pedro became the emperor of Brazil, and still had relations with Portugal, of course. There was a brief struggle, but Brazil was so big to manage, and Portugal is such a small country that Brazil quickly became the, let's say, the large offspring of the small kingdom of Portugal, and Dom Pedro became the emperor of this vast country, and again more immigration came and settled. Then in 1831 he abdicated to his son Dom Pedro II. At the time there was a lot of social conflict in in Brazil, because they were importing a great amount of slaves, and this led to the slave plantation economy, mostly in the north, also working in some of the mines. But the Queen Isabella was the first to promote the abolition of slavery in Brazil, and for instance, she pushed through a decree from Dom Pedro that the children of slaves would be free, and that was the beginning of abolition of slavery in Brazil, which didn't finally come true until 1888. Now, the son of Dom Pedro I was the second, and he abdicated in 1889 to a military coup d'etat led by General Manuel de Fonseca, and it established the Republic of Brazil and ended the monarchy. Now, some of the family still lives here today. We saw in Paraty one of the houses of one of the princes of the royal family of Brazil. They keep a fairly low profile and are mere citizens now, but this family was somewhat revered among certain elements of society. But one thing you must realize when you're in Brazil and in Rio in particular, it has a royal background, and there is a remnant nobility around and some very wealthy elite that are tucked away in some enclaves and reserves. You don't really see much presence of it except in the historic monuments. But the city grew and continued to prosper over time. Now, Brazil, by 1900, had become the world's largest producer of coffee, sugar cane, timber was coming out. Then the great rubber boom happened in the Amazon that I'll talk about when we get up there. And then the city began to grow. Now, as you can see, there were little patches of development around these great mountains and beaches. It wasn't like other cities that had a vast plain to grow in. So this has been the structural or the geographic problem of Rio de Janeiro, is how do you link all of these neighborhoods that sprawl out and are somewhat distinct and hard to get to. Now, I put in a number of pictures of what Rio looked like in, let's say, its days of when it was a smaller city and it was far away. You could only get here by ship. And of course, aviation came in quickly. The great Brazilian aviator Dumont was based in Rio de Janeiro, and the local airport's still named after him. But if you had to take a ship all the way from Europe to come to Brazil, that was how many weeks? And so Brazil had this great reputation of being a grand destination that you would go for quite a while and stay for a while. And this was particularly made famous in certain films with Carmen Miranda and The Road to Rio and all of those sort of movies that gave this great tropical paradise feeling to Rio de Janeiro. And you can see in this pictures from the 20s that the city was fairly low level. And you can imagine that it may have had its problems with, let's say, too many horses in the street, but it was a much more pleasant city back then than it has become now, where the population has grown so much that here's Copacabana back when you could have a real cabana, rather than a giant hotel row like a Miami Beach. And back when the buildings were small, the mountains looked bigger and the people looked bigger too. In 1911, the first cable car was taken up to Sugarloaf Mountain, Pau de Açúcar. Now it goes up all the way to the top, and that's something to do if you've never done it. That's one of the great views of the city. Here's the great Pico de Gavea, it's called, one of the other mountains that's over near Ipanema. So you can imagine just what it was like back before, let's say, traffic jams gobbled up the town. But it grew like everything has over the years. This is one of the great Avenida de Vargas, and you can appreciate the, let's say, Victorian, Italianate kind of architecture that is now almost all demolished and put up with big square concrete blocks of, I would call, brutal modernism. And so you'll only see a little bit of, let's say, the elegant Rio de Janeiro in the downtown area. And as the city grew and these tunnels were put, this is over to Lagoa area, the Lake District, and you can get through this otherwise disunited city. This began the era of mass transportation. They put in the trams, and now they have a subway, and then, of course, all the highways come into town. So the city is just sort of booming with people. At this point, you'll see that a lot of people have come to Rio to look for a better life, especially from the Northeast, where agriculture is difficult and there's a constant oversupply of a population that doesn't have enough work. So this is the early days of Rio, and nowadays you can see that it is a concrete jungle somewhat, but various areas are very upscale and others are very poor. And typically anything on the waterfront and down in the flats are expensive condominiums housing. This is Ipanema, which is on the one side is the Lagoa, a lake, and then the other side is the beach, and then you have these beautiful islands that are just off the beach. And this is the most exclusive neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. That was also the home of the musicians of the Bossa Nova era, and there's still some monuments in the museum now, especially to Tom Jobim, the great composer, and his home was right here in Ipanema. Now, some people have said that I was once asked, why are the mountains in Rio de Janeiro shaped like buttocks? To which I have to say, I'm not a geologist. I don't know what that means in certain terms, but here's a view of Ipanema Beach. And if you take one of the courtesy limousines or buses over to the jewelry shops, and then you can walk just a couple blocks to the beach and go for a swim. It's a clean beach over in Ipanema. Copacabana is a little bit in the bay and not as clean, and it's much more crowded because there are a lot of hotels there. But if you go there, you'll see that it's very spectacular, one of the great beaches in any city in the world. Here again is some of the mountains, the national park, Park de Tijuca it's called, up in the hills. And you can see again some of the favelas crawling up the mountainside. Up in this particular national park, they've had a recent controversy because so many people are building their own shacks up into the national park that the Park Service has started to put walls up to keep the people out and away from the wildlife. And that has led to the typical argument, who's more important, the birds or the people? Well, I leave that to you to discuss at dinner. But here's the Ipanema Beach again on a nice day. There are different areas that are sectioned off. They have volleyball courts, and they have, this is an area where all the, a certain football club, Botafogo, gathers under their flag, and this is one of the passions of the city, of course, is football, and so it's shown on even the beaches where they have their own team areas. Last time I was there, I picked out of the surf a little seahorse, and I gave it to this little girl. So the sea is quite alive right here, even though it's in a major city. Another creature that I found on my walk through there was this coming out of the harbor. This is a major oil rig that looked like a giant sea monster coming out around the bend, and it was being towed out to sea to continue the exploration offshore. But most of the wildlife is here on the beaches, and it's said that in Rio de Janeiro people only work so that they can take time off to go to the beach, and often they'll show up in the morning, but in the afternoon, if it's a nice day, they all go to the beach, and so that's where they do most of their discussions. And one of the characteristics of these beaches is they all have on the great beautiful sidewalks of the calçada, they call this black and white stoneware sidewalks that are a typical Portuguese sidewalk if you've seen them in Lisbon, but they all are a little different in every area. So I was reading somewhere that a carioca, which is the name of the Rio de Janeiro inhabitants, if you blindfold them and take them around town and then you only let them see the sidewalk, they'll know just where they are, because no two are alike all over the city. So if you're in Copacabana, that is the main tourist area and hotel row. There's the great Copacabana Hotel, which has a beautiful lobby and is more classical, copied after a hotel in Nice. But a lot of them are now big kind of square boxes and modernized rather than the old style. But along the avenue, you'll get the strolling musicians and little stands they call pagoji, which is like a pagoda. They're little lunch stands. And then along the way, there are locals that will make these great sand castles for a donation. So this is the life of the beach, which is really the heart of life in Rio de Janeiro. The other part of it, of course, is the main sport is, of course, body watching. And so for those of you who are anthropologists or sociologists or some other hobby, this is the place to come and keep an eye on the evolution of humanity. Now, this is where Rio de Janeiro is a fairly uninhibited town, but it is, just to let you know, it is illegal to be nude, but it's not illegal to be next to nude. So the little bikinis, people think they were invented in France, supposedly, but they're actually a native Brazilian custom that women would wear a tiny little patch. That's all they needed. I guess the men were not that hard to chase away, but anyway, this is what the sport is. It's just sort of making sure that you're well bronzed and tanned, and so you can take it for what it is. Of course, some are livelier than others, and body watching is the main sport in Rio de Janeiro. I myself am a 3-minute egg, so I'm under the shade just on a UN peace observing status. There's also a lot of visitors. You'll see all of what they call the fresh off the plane, getting sunburned and often being led astray or to entertainment by some of the locals. So there's a considerable business in Rio. Of course, had a terrible reputation for its wildlife, which continues under some caution now. But as you go away from the beaches, then you can come and see, as you will, some of the other parts of the town, which are, I have a few pictures of some of the remnant, elegant architecture. Here's one of the ferry terminals that goes across the bay. And then this is a chapel for the founding of the city that's right down in the near the main square, not far from where we land. There's a lot of old Portuguese churches in the city that are surrounded now by office buildings, but they've kept a certain amount of the area with the small lanes and cafes. And so you're just wandering around the town in the daytime, you'll always be surprised by what you'll see. Now this is right where we dock. This is the Praça Mao, and it has a war monument and a few other landmarks right there, but you can see there's some big office buildings and such. Here's another of the Portuguese churches, which features that azuelo, the blue tile work, which is quite lovely. Now, a lot of these churches are historic monuments. They're not very active as churches. Rio de Janeiro is not known as a very religious town. I don't know why. But in the center of the downtown, you'll come to this, the Teatro Municipal, which is the main square for the cultural institutions, including the National Museum and a number of opera theater houses, and again, these great calçada sidewalks. So that this is a big city with its own monuments that are quite beautifully kept these days. Here is the courthouse with a demonstration, political demonstration that was there a couple of years ago. So there's still quite a bit of, let's say, political activity even in Rio de Janeiro, though the capital again is in Brasilia. Some of the old buildings, though, have more or less been abandoned, except that they keep the facades and make them into parking lots. Of course, the automobile has conquered Rio de Janeiro like many other cities, so that some of them, you see, they're only used to park a few cars, whoever has the privilege in that town. But there's a lot of different places. Here's a view from Sugarloaf and looking down into Gloria district this is, and you see the bridge in the distance. That's where we dock, so that you can appreciate the scale of the city. I don't advise trying to walk from one end of the town to the other. You should go to a place and you can enjoy that neighborhood, but it's a very big city. Across from where we dock is Niterói, and this is one of the new landmarks. This is the Oscar Niemeyer Museum of Modern Art, which is across the bay from where we are. Here's his monument to World War II that's in the Gloria district along the waterfront. So some of the modern architecture is quite striking. The people of Rio de Janeiro, the Cariocas they're called, are very mixed because you'll have both the former Portuguese royalty and a European population, and then you have the Parado, or the mixed blood people, then you have Africans, and you'll even see a few native peoples. But again, you get a great contrast between some are busy and prosperous and some have very little. So you'll see a lot of people who are begging and poor on the street. And I was reading somewhere where a writer said that somebody begging is a better symbol of Rio de Janeiro than the Christ the Redeemer, because there seems to be more and more poverty over the years that are an example of why Rio is somewhat of a conflicted city. As you go out into the neighborhoods, of course, the poor live up the hill. And I'm going to show you a little bit of the neighborhood where I lived, called Santa Teresa. And now this has a tram line and a road that had mansions overlooking the city, built 100 or more years ago. But now all of these shacks have been built up, and as Phil was talking about the other day, because of the financial difficulties of loans and maybe land titles, people just ad hoc build things. And they have a whole informal economy with millions of people living without permission. They have, for instance, they tap in and get free electricity, and the government has tried to get them to pay for some of the electricity at a discount rate, but services up in the favelas is very difficult and a political controversy. There's a new mayor who's trying to, say, clean up the town and give people proper housing and proper services in exchange for more order. The problem of Rio has been that all these poor people come in, they have very little to do, and some will prey on the more prosperous, so the crime rate has been very high. Now, I lived right up this street. I used to take the tram up here, and I lived at a house, unfortunately not this one, but there's some beautiful mansions, some of which are now museums. There's one, the Casa del Sol, the Heavenly Manor, which is a art museum from a wealthy family who gave the building. I believe it's this one. Quite fantastic architecture up there, but a bit of a climb. And this is an area that is used to be very wealthy, but now some of the houses are abandoned. This is where I used to live. It has a view of Corcovado. And I went back there a couple of years ago to go see my old girlfriend, and it turned out the house was empty, and I finally found her, and she said that they had to move out because the violence was so bad in the neighborhood. And they had friends who were held for ransom, some people were murdered, and drug gangs have moved up and preyed upon these neighborhoods, way up, even though, Christ, you'd think he'd be a better guardian for the neighborhood, but it's one of the tragedies of Rio that some of the best housing and neighborhoods are that dangerous. So this is the current problem of the city, but it's still full of life. It's not dangerous in the day. You can go all of these places. Some people even go on tours into the favelas with somebody who can translate, and the people are actually friendly. It's the gangs at night that are the real danger, and there have been fights in the neighborhoods. This is actually a picture from Sao Paulo that got thrown in here just because it shows the terrible contrast and also the pollution that comes out of some of these areas. But Rio has had some 50 murders per 100,000 people a year. That's 25 murders a week, including fights between armed gangs and now paramilitary police. And it has been fueled by the twin troubles of gambling. They have a game called the Jogo do Bicho, which is a gambling, like a lottery on the street, that is controlled by an organized groups, and then also drug dealing. Cocaine and other drugs have come in, and this means that it's had a lot of trouble, including the assassination by informal police groups of the street kids. And they said that in the last 10 years, some 6,000 children have been murdered because they were considered vermin and they were not ever going to go to school. They set up places for some of them to get care and a home and education, but once they get used to the life on the street, they don't really want that, some of them. And so there's been some terrible abuses of some of the street kids, though again I was reading one of the human rights advocate who was living in Brazil advocating for these kids, got mugged and wounded himself, and he caught the kid and gave him to the police, and the police beat the kids up. And then he protested that the police were beating the kid, and then the police answered, well, why don't you take them to court yourself then? But the crime is very serious in the city, and the standard advice is just don't take any valuables with you, don't go out at night. It is safe in the downtown areas in the daytime, but at night it can be different. This is a very big political issue in Brazil and worse in Rio, but one of the former presidents